Dorothy, if I asked Michelle to pray at 7 o'clock in the morning, I would need prayer. When I found out that the topic was marriage, I was actually pretty excited. Michelle and I have been married for 16 years now, and we're really passionate about marriage. We're passionate about it because we've been through the highs and the lows and a lot of just kind of ordinary days that just run into each other. Our first year of marriage was actually really tough. Well, at least according to Michelle, it was really tough. I thought it was okay. But I now know if one person thinks it's tough, it's tough. We've gone through the highs of traveling to various parts of the world and amazing vacations, and we've gone through the lows of finding out that we couldn't have kids and just the pain of all of that. And so we feel that through it all, we have a passion that we hope can inspire and challenge and comfort others. So it's out of that I'm kind of sharing this morning. But then I started to think about, what about those who aren't married? What about those who have lost a loved one? Those who are divorced? Those who are single and hoping in the Lord for a spouse? People who are single and they're happy? What about young people who are nowhere near the age to be married? You know, the young kids are saying, calm down, focus on school, you have all this time in front of you. What could I say in a message on marriage to them? Today we want to focus on marriage because it's important to all of us. It's important to those of us who are married, but it's also important to those who are planning to get married or are planning to remarry. It's important to people as parents, because as parents we're trusting that, you know, if you have a little kid or if you have an adult kid and they plan or are thinking about getting married, we want to create a space where they can come to you for advice, or where they can see the example that you're setting, that positive example, and that will speak to them. But the reality is that some of us are in marriages that are struggling, that are on the verge of something really painful, maybe like divorce. Some of us here this morning are in marriages that are just surviving. It's not good, it's not bad, but it's kind of it's not passionate, and you're just kind of going from day to day. And some of us are in marriages that are growing. There's no pressing issues, and things are going well. I think the first thing I want to say is that whatever situation you find yourself in this morning, you're not alone. You are not the only person here that is in a marriage that's growing and going well. You're not the only person here that's in a marriage that's kind of just surviving. And you're not the only person here that is in a marriage that's struggling. I think for the enemy, his main tactic is to divide and conquer. And a lot of times, he attacks us by making us feel that we're the only ones, that we're alone. You're not the only one this morning. We're all here at various places, many in the same place together. Struggle is normal, but hope is available. Struggle is normal, but hope is available. And so I think the Lord has a word for all of us this morning. I'm going to start by quickly outlining why marriage matters to all of us as a church, whether you're married or not. Then we're going to talk about the best or one of the best ways to protect your marriage for those who are married. We're going to look at Proverbs chapter 5 to cover that. And I'm going to give you some practical tips. And finally, for all of us, whether married or not, I'm going to speak about the big picture of marriage in the Bible and how it applies to all of us. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm heavily indebted to a book called Married People by Ted Lowe and Doug Fields, as well as some commentaries that I was reading for the thoughts that I kind of pulled together for this sermon. So why does marriage matter to the church? Marriage matters to the church because when marriages thrive, then families thrive. When marriages thrive, then families thrive. Think of the impact that things like divorce have, financial stress, abuse, neglect. You know, if there's cheating or addiction, think of the effect that that has on the home and on those people that are in the home. The statistics say that children who experience those things in their home are more likely to repeat it. So that's not to say that that's the only option, and if that's happened to you, your children are going to repeat the same thing, but it's just saying that it's more likely. And even if just a few were to experience that, isn't that enough for us to say that we want to try and do something to prevent that from happening to the next generation? I would think so. So when marriages thrive, families thrive. Secondly, marriage matters to the church because marriage is an illustration of Jesus and the church. So marriage is the image that God uses to show us what the relationship between Jesus and the church is like. And you might not think of your marriage as a mirror image of the relationship of Jesus and the church, but look at this verse here. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. So when you look at a verse like this and some others, it shows you that marriage shouldn't be about what we get out of it. It should be about what we put into it. And when you look at what Jesus has done for the church, when you look at how he gave his life, how he sacrificed, that should be what we should be aiming for in our relationships. And when marriages are strong in the church and healthy, it's actually a form of sharing your faith with other people. Because other people looking around will want to know how it is that your marriage is strong, and then you'll be able to share about Jesus. It will stand out. Because even though the society seems to be going in a different direction, you'd be hard-pressed to find a person who would actually say they don't want a good marriage. Everybody knows that a good marriage is the way that it's supposed to be if you're in a relationship. And thirdly, marriage matters to the church because marriage is a spiritual issue. So early on in our marriage, Michelle and I, without fail, we used to argue every Sunday right before church. And what do you think that did for me going to church? I came to church mad. I saw you guys and I said hi. And I'm like, I'm so fake. I don't even deserve to be here. And it just took me right out of worship. You know what I mean? And so obviously the enemy would do anything possible to take you out of experiencing Jesus in a real way. It's a spiritual issue. Sometimes it was my fault. Sometimes it was the enemy's fault. Mostly it was Michelle's fault. Can I get a ride home, please? But when marriages aren't working, it robs us of our best relationship with God. Because if you're like me, you're going to have a hard time connecting with God when you're at odds with your spouse, because it's a spiritual issue. And then on the flip side, marriage has a chance to change you in a positive way. One way or the other, your relationship is going to transform you. You spend that much time with a person, you just can't hide. Thankfully for me, Michelle has never let me get away with anything. So she's always challenging me to become the best me that I can be. And as we both draw closer to Jesus, then we both draw closer to each other. So marriage matters, and it matters to the church. When marriages thrive, families thrive. It's an illustration of Jesus in the church, and it's a spiritual issue. Make sense? So look at the person next to you and say, marriage matters. So since marriage matters, how can we protect it? How can we protect marriage? There's much that can be said about how to protect marriage, but for today, if you'll allow me, I just want to focus on one thing. I just want to focus on fun. Because one of the best ways to protect your marriage is to enjoy it. One of the best ways to protect your marriage is to enjoy it. And they say that there's two ways to keep animals on a farm. So if you have a farm, then, you build a fence, and when you build that fence, the animals can't get out. And it also protects the animals from intruders or other things that would threaten them trying to get in. So you build a fence. The second way is to build a well. So you build a water source at the center of the property. And because there's that water source, the animals are going to want to stay close to the water. They're not going to stray too far from that source of life, from that water. So which of these do you think we need in our marriage? Both. We need both. We need to protect our marriages from outside forces that are coming in, trying to attack us or distract us or destroy us. But we also need to nourish our marriages from the center, from the inside. So let's open our Bibles to the book of Proverbs, and we're going to look at chapter 5 today. You can read the whole chapter, but today I'm just going to look at a few of the verses. The whole book of Proverbs is a book about wisdom. So knowledge is when you know about something, but wisdom is when you know how to apply that knowledge in the actual situation that you find yourself in. So if you know about something, but you're not applying it to your life, you're not wise. So for example, if you're preaching a sermon and your wife can't defend herself, and then you say that she mostly caused the fights, that's not wise. It's not wise because you know it's actually not the truth. And it's also not wise because in a sermon on marriage, it's kind of anti-marriage to throw your spouse under the bus. Just for example. In this chapter, Solomon warns his son against adultery. I'm going to look at Proverbs chapter 5, and I'm going to start with 15 to 17. So here it says, "Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers." So this image might be lost on us this morning, but it would easily be picked up in the original context that it was written in. Thousands of years ago, water was such a precious resource. And so the act of spilling water in the street would be scandalous. It would be wasteful, and it could lead to death because water was so precious and scarce. And that's the image that's being portrayed here. At the beginning of the chapter, there's an adulteress, and her lips are said to be dripping with honey, and she has smooth speech, and it's so seductive, and it seems so enticing. But when you get involved with her, it's a trap, and it turns bitter, and it's sharper than a double-edged sword, it says, if you read on. And that's the risk that someone takes who is married and tries to find the love and joy they should be finding in their spouse, in someone else, or in anything else for that matter. A few years ago, I was teaching a class on sex for the grade 6 to grade 8 students. So I had a fish tank. I had this betta fighting fish. I brought the tank, I brought the fish, and I brought it to the class. Put it there. I told everybody, this is my betta fighting fish. Name is Rusty. Told them all the story about how I got it. And then I said, this fish is trapped. Is it fair that this fish is in this small little bowl? And they're like, no. And I'm like, yeah, so we should free this fish, right? And they're like, yeah, the fish should be free. And then I had my spoon, and I just went like this. The spoon was still pointing out. I just went like this. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm going to free the fish. They're like, you can't do that. I'm like, but you said it's not fair that the fish is just in this little container. And they started going crazy. They're like, murderer! Oh my goodness! You can't! Animal cruelty! What are you doing? And there were 2 kids. And 2 kids were like, do it, do it, do it, do it. But the other 28 kids were freaking out. They looked like they were on the verge of tears. And I'm like, what's the problem? And I'm like, the fish will die. And I'm like, exactly. For us, we feel like the rules that God has given to us make our world small. We feel like it's like an unfair boundary or a trap. But the truth is that God is protecting us. And it's when you try to live outside of God's protection, that's when you die. That's when you're not truly living. And that's when you're not living God's best. And so if you go outside of your marriage to enjoy things like sex, you will die. It's not just cheating on your spouse, though. It's not just things like pornography, which is a huge problem. It's the fact that we are taught by society to live our lives in terms of what we need in the moment, instead of the commitments that we've made. And this goes for couples, but it goes for all of us. For married couples, remember the vow that you made when you got married. For richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, till death do us part. We need to honor that commitment. That's the protection that God has given for us to enjoy love and intimacy and marriage. One of the best ways to protect your marriage is to enjoy it. For the opposite example of that, look at David in the Bible. So David, most famous king of all time, he has his wife. He has a few wives, a few concubines, but that's another story, right? So you would think that he would be able to enjoy marriage. But no, he sees this other woman, and he says, I'm going to go outside of my marriage because I'm going to enjoy this. This is going to be more fun. And he got trapped in that moment. And what ended up happening? He had sex with her. She got pregnant. He had to come up with this elaborate scheme, and long story short, he ended up killing the man who was married to her, who was actually someone he knew and fought for him. The woman, whose name is Bathsheba, has the baby. The baby dies. Solomon, or King David's family, is so fractured and splintered that over time, it just falls apart, and he actually has this one son that tries to take over the kingdom. That son ends up dying, and you have David saying, I wish I could die in my son's place. There are consequences for our actions. When you try to take what is not yours, you end up losing what is. Look at the end of this proverb. It says this: your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. So in the beginning, there's this adulteress, and her lips are dripping with honey, and she's all sweet, and you feel like experiencing this outside is going to be more fun than what you're experiencing inside. But the image is that it's a trap, it's a snare. It's like you're tied up with cords, and then the hunter can easily come and capture you. And then you lose all that you had trying to grasp what you didn't have. And who wrote this, by the way? Solomon wrote this. And who is Solomon? Solomon is David's son. So Solomon is writing to his son to try and prevent him from making these same mistakes. But in our society, we watch a movie, we see a TV show, and they show a short clip on marriage, and it starts going bad, and all of a sudden there's this new relationship and new marriage. Right? That's what we see on TV. That's in the songs that we listen to. So it kind of programs us to just go for what feels best in the moment. But God's plan is different. His plan is for us to stay together, to say no to what is out of bounds, so that we can say yes and make space for God's gift to us, which is marriage. Marriage is God's gift to us. We want to battle this lie that just pleasing yourself is the primary goal of human life, because it's not. Our goal is to glorify God. And God gives us joy. And He gives us ways to fulfill our lives and experience that, but not at the expense of bringing Him glory, and not at the expense of our character or our faith. Holiness is greater than happiness. Holiness is greater than happiness. So if you're married or you plan to be married, drink from your own cistern. Drink from your own well. Be faithful. Be faithful. One of the best ways to protect your marriage is to enjoy it. So be intentional, because marriage is hard work, but it's worth it. Say no to the things that are outside of marriage. Say no to cheating on your spouse. Say no to pornography. Give your best at home. Say no to giving your best at work and then coming home giving your leftovers. Say no to things like sports taking up most of your time and energy and care, or shopping, or whatever it might be. Kids, anything else that can take the place of your spouse, that gift that God has given to you. Here's a little list here from a psychologist. His name is John Gottman, about what helps to build marriages. So pleasure, intimacy, admiration with respect, passion, and commitment to a shared future. So maybe choose one of these to work on. You're choosing it for yourself. You're not choosing it for your spouse. You're choosing it for yourself, right? On the flip side, here's a list of destructive characteristics: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, withdrawal. So the same thing. Maybe there's something on this list that you can choose for yourself to work on. For me, because I was preaching the sermon and God was talking to me, I have to work on my defensiveness. So anytime Michelle says something to me, I always have an excuse. I always come up with some reason, and I'm able to kind of, instead of just hearing what she says, I always got to say something back. She said, you can't just, I'm always having to say something. So I'm working on it by withdrawing. Because I'm just not good at saying something nice, so I'll just say nothing. God's like, okay, yeah, good luck with that. So we all have things that we have to work on. I'm going to give you some more practical tips on how to have fun in your marriage, and then I'm going to remind us all on how marriage matters to all of us. And I'm going to have a challenge for all of us, married or not. For couples, I know many of you are super busy with work, with kids, taking care of your parents, trying to be healthy yourself, trying to make space. It just seems hard to find an extra space now for your marriage. But I'm still going to gently nudge you and challenge you to miss something. You know, maybe you miss one of your kids' activities, or you take a day off work, something. Because there's never going to be this good or this great or this perfect day to work on your marriage. And things from the outside are always going to be there. But I'll tell you this, if you miss one of your kids' soccer games to work on your marriage, your kid is not going to be upset when you have a strong marriage down the line. So make space for your marriage. It'll bless you, it'll bless your kids, your family, your friends, and all of us. Another challenge I would have for you guys is just to take divorce right off the table. Take divorce off the table. So as long as divorce is an option, your marriage isn't going to be what God intends it to be. Just having a little change like that makes a big difference. So for Michelle and I, because we took divorce off the table, it forced us to work on our issues. So because we weren't going to get divorced, and I had an anger problem, Michelle was like, work on your anger problem, because I'm not going to be married for the rest of my life to a person like that, right? So she forced me to deal with that issue. When you know that someone loves you, like no matter what, it gives you that freedom to be fully yourself. But then it also makes you responsible. So because I know that she's not going to divorce me, it's like pressure on me because I want to not give her a reason to want to divorce me. So it's a responsibility and it's a privilege. It's a blessing. And obviously there are cases where divorce is the right option, but what we're saying here is that God's ideal is for us to stay together. And as much as possible, we should be working on that. A little plug for small groups. Be in a small group. Small groups, if you really get to be in them and you share and you're open, you can't hide. And those can be great places and spaces for you to work on your marriage. It's a great place for you to work on your relationships in general. So be in a small group. And for many of you guys, I'm just going to encourage you guys to have dates. So I said there were kind of 3 types of marriages. There were those that are growing, so those that are going really well. There are those that are surviving, so those that are kind of just going day to day and maybe lacking passion. And then we said those that are struggling, right? Those that are going through a tough time. So if you're growing, my challenge for you would be, hey, maybe look for some couples that you could mentor and encourage. It's not saying that you're perfect, that you have it all together, but since you're in this blessed season, maybe allow God to use you to bless someone else. If you're in a relationship, if you're in a marriage that is struggling or surviving, I'm going to suggest that you guys try and have a date night. Michelle and I have been having 2-hour date nights every week for the last 16 years. We've probably missed about 10. Like just times when it was like we were so mad, we're like, you can't have a date now, right? But as much as possible, we have tried to stick to that 2 hours in a week, 2 hours on the weekend. And you might say, okay, it's easy for you guys, you don't have kids, but I know this couple that mentored us that I look up to, and when they had little toddlers, like 4 and 5 years old, they used to have like 10 or 15 minutes. They blocked off this area in the living room, and they had their date. And they said, like the kids knew, you can't talk to mommy and daddy during this time. And they just took a breath. They just looked at each other. They just, you know what I mean? They just took that time to be intentional and to pay attention to each other. So it doesn't have to be this elaborate, go on a road trip or go to this fancy restaurant. It could just be like, and it teaches the kids too, that this mommy and daddy thing, this marriage matters. So make space and date each other. I'm going to give you a practical tip that you could do. And I also, on my sermon notes, so if you go online after, or you go on the app, there's going to be a whole bunch of different date ideas. I'm just going to share one with you today, but if you go online, you'll be able to see, I think it's 4 ideas that you could do when you go on a date. But before you get to the date, especially if you have kids, what do you do with the kids? I got you. Number 1, pay for babysitting. Number 2, get family or friends to babysit for free. Just beg. Number 3, you can ask another couple who has kids and you can swap. So we'll babysit your kids for free so you guys can go on a date, and then you babysit our kids so that we can go on a date. You go first though. So when you get to this date, you got the babysitting for free, and you're on the date, here are 3 little questions just to get you started. And like I said, you can go online, and at the end of my sermon, you'll see a bunch of other ideas, but here's just one. You can say to your spouse, one of the nicest things you've ever done is, right? So you answer that question, and then you say that to your spouse. Secondly, without you, I would never, and you finish that statement. And last thing, the thing I love about you most is, so these are just things to get your conversation started just to inject a little fun in your marriage. And you might be thinking, seriously, a date night? Like that's my takeaway from the sermon this morning? And I would say, yeah, it is. It's not, and you might not think it's super spiritual, but I would say divorce is not super spiritual either. And by having fun in your marriage, it gives you like just a little bit of hope to keep on keeping on. We can make it. And so that's why this morning I felt, let's start by having fun. And I want to end by saying, how does this apply to all of us? I said that this applies to all of us, whether you're married or not. And if you look back at the book of Proverbs, it's all about wisdom. This whole chapter and book is about the pursuit of wisdom. So in this specific chapter, it's about a faithful marriage and the threat of adultery. But the bigger picture is pursuing wisdom. A wise person in this passage is a person who is faithful to their spouse. But the bigger picture is a wise person is faithful to God. And like we said in the beginning, marriage is an illustration of Jesus and the church. And the church is the bride of Christ. So in this passage, there's an adulterous woman, and she tries to lead an unwise person, an unwise man, into faithfulness away from the spouse. And in life, the seductions of this world, they lead us away from being faithful to Jesus. And the same way it would be foolish to have a spouse and yet try to have someone else or have something else at the same time, it's foolish to be in a relationship with Jesus, but try to fulfill yourself in all of these other worldly ways. So this applies to all of us, because as a church, we are all the bride of Jesus Christ. And so to remind you of how much you're worth, I want to share a story from John. In John chapter 14, 1-4, it says this. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. So we might miss what this means in our society, but people in the first century would immediately know what this means. And I picked this up from a book called Forgotten Jesus. It talks about the fact that before an engagement, the parents of the man, in particular the father of the man, would be on a journey to find a bride suitable for his son. When he found someone, he would get his son, he would get the bride, and he would get the bride's father to negotiate a price. And the price would show kind of respect to the bride's household, because the bride's family would be losing this important contributing member of the family. After they agreed on this price, the four of them would share a meal together, and they would solidify this covenant, this commitment, with a cup of wine. Does that start to sound familiar? The Last Supper. They would take the wine, and the groom would drink from it, and then he would offer it to the woman, showing that he's willing to give up his life for his bride. The bride would take the cup, and she would drink, accepting that covenant. The father and the son would then go home, and the son would start building a home for his bride. The father would have to approve of it. The son would always come and say, "Is it ready yet?" The father would say, "No, not yet. You still have to do this," or he's checking over it. Finally, when it's approved, then the father and the son would go back to the village. The bride all this time has been waiting, and now the bride is looking, and the groom comes, and then the groom comes and takes the bride, and they go off to be in their home. So when Jesus takes the wine and he drinks it, and he offers it to them to drink, they would know that Jesus was proposing to them. And they would know that Jesus is saying that I'm giving up my life for you. Like, that's how much you're worth to me. So if you're here this morning, you're married, you're single, you're divorced, wherever you are in your journey, you are the bride of Christ. And Jesus laid down his life for you. That's how much you're worth. And he's going and he's preparing a place for you. And he's going to come back and get you. So we live a life that has to be ready for Jesus. I'm going to call the worship team to come up. And as the worship team comes up, I just want to challenge us. Knowing that Jesus is going to be coming back for all of us. What does it look like to be married? What does it look like to be ready for Jesus in your marriages? If you are struggling or just surviving, how can you have fun and protect your marriage so that it's ready for Jesus? If you're single this morning, how do you remember that Jesus is married to you and he laid down his life for you and he loves you and you matter to him? We draw closer and closer to Jesus, and then he draws us closer to each other. So if you're struggling this morning, I want you to look up to Jesus. If you're just surviving this morning, I want you to look up to Jesus. That's where our help comes from, when Jesus is the center. Amen? Amen.